Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs. So Stephen is a prophet. Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. Now, it's difficult to tell whether this is one synagogue or it's several synagogues, all of which are considered. Luke is a little bit ambiguous, but it has not much to do with the point, other than to say that according to Josephus, there were 480 Hellenistic synagogues in Jerusalem at this time. That seems like overkill. If you got 30,000 people and you got 480 synagogues of Hellenistic Jews, again, Josephus, you don't know. But I guess the point would be there were a lot. And notice the Hellenists had their own synagogues, so they didn't have to mix with those Judean Jews. There's segregation going on here. But isn't it interesting that that big opposition to Christianity comes from an unexpected source? Well, we expect the Sanhedrin. That's expected. But Hellenistic Jews, that's a bit unexpected. Why do you think it's beginning to come from Hellenistic Jews? And I think we've already touched on it, we just didn't make it explicit. Why do you think the Hellenistic synagogues are getting upset? It's their members. The first 3,000 were all their members.
Gotta stop the leaking.
Gotta stop this, yeah, gotta close the back door, man. So opposition arose. And these men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Spirit by whom he spoke. And Luke here really identifies Stephen as a prophet, inspired by the Spirit of the risen Lord. And I just would love to, in English, read some of those arguments. I just read Paul's argument in Romans, and it's difficult to understand in English, but the way they can argue with Midrash is just so different, at least from the way I think. But amazing. Verse 11, then they secretly persuaded the men to say, we've heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses. Oh, and God too, but Moses. How dare he speak of it against Moses and God? It's just curious that they say Moses and God, because Moses was incredibly important. Now, did Stephen do that? No. But who else did they say that about? Jesus. So Luke wants us to see Stephen clearly in the line of the prophetic spirit of Jesus, being attacked just as Jesus was. So they, probably meaning the synagogues, they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. That's the Sanhedrin. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, this fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. And again, that's a parallel to Jesus. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. What were the customs, Moses? He doesn't use the word for law or commandment. The customs of Moses that handed down. It's changing the customs. Do you know what they were? Basically, rules of table fellowship. How Jews relate to Gentiles. He's trying to change that. Now that's true. That part of the charge is actually rather true, though whether Stephen said it or not, but we know it is happening. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. What's Luke signaling us there?
He's a messenger.
Messenger, yeah. Do you remember a similar line from the Old Testament? Where their faces shone. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So God was with them. As Jesus, the Son of Man, stood with them in the fiery furnace, is the Son of Man going to stand with Stephen? Mm-hmm. Exactly right. So he sets us up for the reference to the Son of Man standing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Jesus standing receiving. Okay, now here's this discourse. This is the longest single discourse in the book of Acts. The interesting thing is it looks a lot like Peter's and Paul's speeches, except it's longer. And it picks up actually, where Peter kind of left some things out on Pentecost, Stephen picks them up and builds on what Peter said, and exactly the vocabulary and style and the syntax of Luke. This speech is the key for interpreting the book. Right here, Luke lays out, this is what this book is all about. This summarizes the point of the book of Acts. The high priest asked him, "Are these charges true?" To this he replied. And here comes a long answer to that question. Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham. And basically what he's saying here is that Abraham was a Gentile and a pagan when God appeared to him and made the promise. Abraham and God's promises to him are of central importance to Luke in this book. I'll say that again. Abraham and God's promises to him are of central importance to Luke in the book of Acts. So he starts to chronicle the story. He left the pagan land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of God, sent him to this land where you are now living. So he came from pagan country as a pagan to the promised land. He gave him no inheritance here, not even a foot of ground. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. Question: what constitutes family membership? That's why Luke, Paul are going to argue that who was Abraham's son and the inheritor of the promise? Who was his firstborn? Ishmael. But it wasn't Ishmael. Why? He was the genealogy of Abraham, his firstborn son. What do the scriptures tell us?
Not the son of promise.
Not the son of the promise. Isaac was by grace. Sarah was, 100 years old? By grace. Through faith did you have the son of it. I mean, doesn't this preach? Can you imagine if you were a Jew, Jewish Christian before a Jewish audience, wouldn't you want to rehearse that story?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, doesn't that just nail the gospel right down there? That's absolutely. Don't you guys get it? This is the way it's always been. So it's a very powerful argument. And Luke is going to focus on the promise. And as I said, for Luke, what is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham? The Holy Spirit. Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit, because he ministers all that Jesus did for us, to us. That's how we receive the gift. Verse 8, then he gave Abraham the sign of the covenant, not the covenant of circumcision, NIV, the sign of the covenant, circumcision. And Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of 12 patriarchs. And because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, so the patriarchs were what? Idolaters. What happens to an idolater? You get disqualified. So they all became disqualified, and Joseph became the head. Though he certainly was not the firstborn. So what makes family? It's not genealogy, evidently. It's not the genealogical firstborn.
It's belief.
It's faith and belief, yeah.